Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. We have about 60 people, so I think we'll start now. I'm Kim Madden from Advocates for Children.
And I'm Karen Herrera, and I'm the Parent Center Advocate at AFC.
So thank you so much for coming. I know this is always an intense process. We'll go through some introductions, and I'm going to do a poll actually first, just so we can find out a little bit about who's here. Okay, sorry. Delays. Okay, here we go. All right, so if you can let us know if you're a parent or if there are some students who join sometimes or a professional, and where you live, that would be great. And it looks like we are heavy parent, which is great. This is something that as a parent, when I went through this process, I went to every training I could to try to get information because it seems like so much to learn. So thank you so much. Okay. And one more poll just to see who's here. If you're interested in middle school, high school, or other. Okay, so it looks like I was just making my head spin. We're at 60% middle school and 50% high school, but that means that some of you have the joy of having to do both processes at once. So I know that's got to be a lot, but we will hopefully answer a lot of your questions about it. So thank you so much. Okay, Karen, if you want to start.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So like Kim has just said, we will be walking you all through the middle and high school admissions process for students with disabilities. But before we get into all of that, I wanted to give you all a brief overview of who we are. So AFC is an education-centered independent agency that protects the rights of all New York City students. And we offer a variety of services, starting with our most popular one, which is our helpline, open Monday through Thursday from 10 to 4. Parents call, and our education specialists will offer them technical assistance and resources to help resolve whatever issue is going on. We also offer free legal services to low-income families, as well as guides and resources that are readily available on our website, such as like our special education guide, our suspension guide, and so on. And we also offer workshops and trainings just like this one on a variety of topics. So immigrant and student rights, special education 101. And then finally, we do a lot of policy advocacy and impact litigation.
And also, as we're going along, I imagine no one has questions yet, but if you do have questions, please, we will pause, but you can also put them in the Q&A section, and we'll try to answer them as we go.
All right, so like I just mentioned, we have a ton of guides and resources available on our website, as well if you want to stay updated with what's going on regarding, the DOE, any changes like that, or any changes regarding back to school or the admissions process. We keep our website updated, so please check for updates on our website. Also, our AFC workshops, if you aren't able to make it to one of our webinars, do not worry. We record all of our webinars and upload them to our YouTube channel. And there you can see past recorded webinars on special education. Later in the fall, we're going to be talking about, we're going to be doing our Turning 5 series. So that's walking parents through the pre-K admissions process. But anyways, all of that will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. All right, so for today's agenda, we're going to talk about how to apply, anything new regarding the admissions process, the types of programs, learning more about schools. And like Kim just said, if you have any questions, we're going to have time at the end of this presentation to get to those. But you can also put your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to them when we can. All right, so to get started, we are going to just talk about some school application facts. So New York City has one of the largest school districts in the country. There are 400 middle and 400 high schools. Students can choose up to 12 schools or programs. Something to keep in mind, though, is that specialized high schools or charter schools kind of have their own application. Also, you can apply online using My Schools account, and we'll talk a lot about My Schools tonight. But the application process will happen using My Schools. And then also schools may use different admissions criteria or priorities. Also, I just wanted to mention, since students can choose up to 12 schools or programs, we recommend putting at least 8 quality choices, which means, yes, the more school students apply to, the better their chances of getting in. However, students should never put down the school they don't want to go, they don't want to go to. All right. All right, so some really important dates to keep in mind. So the middle school application opens up next week on October 11th. You have to apply by the 8th of December, and offers will be made around April 3rd. The high school application opened up yesterday, and they have to be in by the 1st of December. And then offers will be made by March 7th. The SHSAT. So if you are interested in your child attending a specialized high school, then you must sign up for the specialized high school standard admissions test by October 27th. And then the test will occur in November, December, and offers will be made by March. And then, like I just said, charter schools have their own process. So you have to apply by April 1st. And yeah. All right, so the process after offers is so basically offers will be made in the spring, so March, April, for any waitlist. So if your child's offer letter will include information about any program where your child is waitlisted, they are automatically on the waitlist for any programs listed higher on your child's application than where they got an offer. So for example, if your child got an offer to their third choice program, they would automatically be on the wait list for their first and second choice program. If your child got an offer to their first choice program, they would not be on any wait list. That is to say, though, if you want to join a wait list, you can, but keep in mind you will be at the bottom of that wait list. And also you can go on My Schools and you can, use it to add or remove your child from any wait lists. So you can check wait lists in real time. All right, so My Schools, in addition to using My Schools to complete a student's application, you can also use My Schools, the My Schools directory to search for middle school and high schools, the admissions criteria and so on. So My Schools is a really essential tool throughout this process, and we'll practice using My Schools later on in this workshop. And here are some things to think about, seats in demand. Is the school you want to apply to very competitive? The priority groups and screens. So what are the admissions criteria for certain schools? Are they giving priority groups to people that, live in the zone, to certain grades, so on. And again, there's no appeal, but there are wait lists by lottery numbers. And again, check out the admissions guide. We have, the New York City, there's the New York City Department of Education's public school admissions guide, where you can find more information regarding this process. All right, so if you would like to view your student's lottery number or grouping, this is just a screenshot of a student's account, and for their privacy, we blurred out their application random number, but this is what it should look like. If you are interested in what a what a random number is, it's pretty much just a long string of, letters and numbers. For example, in the next slide, you'll be able to see what exactly it is that this random number will look like. It's a combination of letters and numbers, and it should look something like this. And if students or parents are interested in more information, there are lots of up-to-date info on the Department of Education's website, including videos that explain the middle and high school admissions process. And, it gives also information on the different types of schools. And also, families may want to watch the videos for more information or sign up for one of the DOE's virtual info sessions on the admissions process. So there are also a ton of upcoming admissions events that the Department of Education is hosting. All right, so now we are going to get into how to apply to middle schools, the middle school application process. So some middle schools have more than one program, such as a general education program and a dual language Spanish program. If you're interested in applying to more than one program at the same school, each program counts as a separate choice on your child's application. Keep in mind, you can apply to up to 12 programs. All right, so many middle school students in New York City attend their zone school. If you have any zone schools, your child has a priority to attend them. There's also, district admissions, so it's only open to students in that district. Same thing with borough, with like students in that borough, and citywide schools, which are open to any New York City student. During the application period, you can log on to My Schools to learn if your child has a zone school. As in terms of district programs are open to schools in that district. And so, yeah, there we go. All right, so in terms of middle school admissions, there are 4 different types. So for screened admissions, some schools screen for grades or have auditions. And if you would like to know if the school you're interested in has screened admissions, then you would go onto My Schools and look at their admissions criteria. Same thing for locations. Some schools prioritize students in their zone, district, or borough. Diversity admission. So some prioritize low-income students, multilingual learners, and students in temporary housing. And then finally, there's lottery admission, which is, for each priority group, if more than applicants than seats are available. All right, and now we're going to stop and see if there are any.
Yeah, I'm going to try to answer a couple questions. Some of them, someone asked about ASD Nest and Horizon programs. We will get into that later in the presentation. But some questions were about lotteries and screens and how those two things interact. So my understanding is that for a lottery, what it means is, obviously that's just your number. Are you going to be at the top of the pile or the bottom of the pile? For screens, they're going to have, the 4 or 5 different groups ranked on your child's grade average and how they're doing in comparison to other students. So let's say your child is a straight A student, you're in the group 1, but you're applying to a school that's one of the most sought after schools. If that school has, and I'm just making this up, 100 seats, and there's 300 people in that group 1 that meet their, and they want to rank for this percentage from group 1, so straight A students or whatever. If there's 300 people in there, then they're going to look at the lottery number. So you obviously still have a better chance than somebody who's in a, one of the lower downs, like a student who has a lower grade point average. But if there's more, and there's no way to know this as a parent, it's just trying to understand how competitive is the school and where does your child fall on that if you're looking at screen schools. Hopefully that makes sense. I know this can be pretty complicated. We will be looking at it in a few different slides. But the idea is basically just to keep in mind that certainly, as Karen said earlier, don't list 12 schools if you don't have 12 schools. Do list 12 schools if you do have 12 schools that you know about and that you think might be a good fit for your child. But conversely, don't list just the 3 most sought after schools and assume they have to give you one of those. That's not how this works. So it is really important to have a healthy mix of schools and to have some that you think, based on all the information you have, and we haven't finished this presentation at all, we've really just started it. But as you get more information, trying to figure out how likely is it that my child or any child is going to get into this school, balanced against, what schools do I think my child might be more likely to get into, and making sure you have a mix. Hopefully that makes sense. We will try to keep your questions coming. If we don't get to them all, certainly We will do our best to try to answer them after the training or at the end of the training. So they're really helpful questions. I think people were asking about, is there a way to list zone schools? Is there a way to research the criteria? We're going to get into that in a minute, but it's really by digging into and understanding my schools, which somebody asked, wait, what's that in comparison to my student? Those are two different websites. They sound really similar, but they're different. And in fact, my student is now called NYXA, or New York City Student Account. And that is something that we have in our special ed training, which is available online, or our back to school training. And it shows you some screenshots of that. That's where, for somebody who's in a public school, you can see what the busing is, what your like general categories for your child's IEP, attendance, a list of schools your child's gone to. For anybody who's in high school or going into high school, it's really helpful to see how many credits you have. But it has nothing to do with applying to schools. The applying to schools is all in my schools. So hopefully that makes sense. Thank you for your great questions, and we'll do our best to keep up with them.
Thank you, Kim. All right, so moving along to the high school admissions process. There are a variety of audition methods that we'll discuss. So the first one being the specialized admissions method, which I just talked about earlier, which is, it's SHSAT. So if you would like your student to attend a specialized high school, then they must take the specialized high school admissions test. And this offer is based on the score that they get from that exam. And then there are screened and auditions, and that's based on 4 tiers, grading tiers, and that's also available on the Department of Education if you are interested to see where your student's grade point average falls under. You can go on the website to see that. And again, those grades are based on 7th grade core class average, so like math, ELA. And then some schools require an essay, an interview, or an audition. And then there's also EdOpt, which takes a range of academic levels. Some seats are filled through ranking, others are random. Oh, and something I wanted to say about screen schools, which is what Kim said earlier, which is when there are more applicants in a priority group than seats available at a particular school, admissions decisions will be made based on each applicant's random number, which is, the lottery number. All right. There are also screen languages. So screen language admissions is for multilingual learners, considered the time the students is in the the considered time in the US for the student, so how long the student has been in the US, and the language proficiency of the student is taken into account. Then there is also transfer, and this is usually for older students, and you can check the program, usually checks the program age and the academic requirements of the school. And then zoned and open. So if you live in a zoned school area, you can just apply, and it's really open. If it's in your zone, then you can apply. And so finally, there is the charter schools. So charter schools have a separate application process. There is a common application where parents can apply to multiple charter schools at once, and that's available through the New York City Charter School Center's website. Many charter middle schools serve students in grades 5th through 8th, as opposed to grades 6th through 8th. So interested students should apply to charter middle schools in 4th grade rather than 5th grade. Most charter schools operate on straight lottery, giving priority to siblings of current students and to students who live in the district. Some charter high schools only admit students from their middle schools. Overall, some charter schools are great and may have extra supports for students who are struggling in certain areas. Others can be incredibly competitive with very strict discipline policies or promotion criteria. So that's something to keep in mind if charter schools are of interest to you.
Okay, so I'm going to take it back over. I noticed there were a number of questions in the chat about moving from a private middle school to applying to a public school and how you get my school's login information. My understanding in the past is that if you were at a special education private school, you could speak with the CSE. If you were at some other kind of school, you could speak with the Family Welcome Center. For people that have tried that and have called in, and there may actually even be a help or a support feature on the DOE website. It sounds like maybe it's more difficult this year. Definitely feel free to reach out to our helpline or write in to us through our email, and we'll try to assist. But first, certainly try, if your child's at a special education school, talking to the committee on special education. And if your child's in just a general education school, talking to the family welcome centers. And you can find this information on the DOE website. My advice for navigating the DOE website is Google is your friend. It's often better than the DOE search engine, although I think it's gotten a lot better. And then for all the questions about how do I research schools, certainly navigating my schools, and we'll go through that, is really important. You can get a sense as to how competitive a school is, what their interests are. Also, though, I would recommend Inside Schools. That's a great place to research schools. They do have more limited information on students with disabilities, and sometimes it's outdated. You should always look and see when the reviews were written. And we'll also go through at the end of this a pretty in-depth way to try to get information from the DOE website, how you can research what services a school provides. It's not perfect, but it will give you a sense. So in this section, though, of the training, we're just going to go through how to learn about a school generally. So not talking, I know a lot of people were like, how do I know if they have a small class? And really important question that we'll go through. But this is more also, your child as just a whole person. Are they interested in sports? Do they need a school that's accessible? Do you need a school that's, wheelchair accessible, for example? Size and location, all these things are really important. So for some students, they really want a bigger school with a variety of classes. Other students really are not going to thrive in a huge school and need something that's smaller and more nurturing. I would say that you and your child know what you need and what environment's going to work better than anyone. Going on tours, you can really get a sense of things. Graduation rates are important. So I think it's important to look at that. For example, when I was looking at high school, I was really leery of any school that had 100% four-year graduation rate, because I knew my child was going to take longer to get through, and I didn't want him to feel stigmatized by that. So it's something to, just to keep in mind. There's no, this is right, this is wrong. There's what's a good fit for your child. And that's obviously incredibly important, making sure that you have a good sense of the school leadership, what the parents are like, what the students are like. So this is an example when you click on a school in My Schools, and it can be a lot of information to look in. We don't have this screen on here, but you can filter by screen schools, by zone schools, by different ways you can filter. And that can give you a sense. You can look at by district. You can look, in different ways. So for this one, for example, for Thurgood Marshall Academy for Learning and Social Change, you can see the address, you can see how many students are there. So it's a 6 to 12 school with 560 students. That's relatively small, I suppose, for a school when you figure that's going to be less than 100 kids per grade. You can click on all those little pluses under performance and academics to see more information. Sorry, hold on. I just need to move something so I can see that. Oh, and then on the very bottom, you can see that little star. That's something that I think people sometimes miss, but that's where you can find out more about the programs. I think for this school, I can't remember from the screenshot, they may just have one program, but some schools have multiple ones. So art and design, for example, a popular high school, has multiple programs. Are you interested in photography or fine art or whatever? They'll have different programs underneath it. So when you click on that, you'll see the admissions for that program. So this is an example where you can see how competitive was it. We'll get into whether or not your child counts as a student with disability. Having an IEP is not the end all and be all. You have to have an IEP that has a certain number of special ed programs in it. So either that you're in an ICT or a small class, or that you get over, I think it's 7 periods of sets a week. And we'll talk about that in another slide, but assuming your child was a student with a disability with an IEP that qualifies for this set aside, right? It's a very nuanced term of art in 4th or 7th grade. So 4th grade for middle school or 7th grade for high school, then your child would be in this second category. And for some schools, it may not matter. For this school, there were 23 seats for students with disabilities, and there were 85 seats for general education students. And it looks like a school that was somewhat popular for students with disabilities because there's more applications per seat for students with disabilities, but just barely. You'll see all different, like it really depends on the school. If you're looking at a school that's known for, not taking students with disabilities or for being super high achieving and then sometimes viewing students with disabilities as not fitting them, you might see something that looks really, really different. But sometimes schools that have very, rigorous criteria for gen ed students, because there's a set aside for students with disabilities, your child, if they qualify as having a disability, may have an easier time getting into that school. Because let's say they have a set aside for 100 students from the first, it's a screen school, and they have 100 seats for the first ranked, the first group, like the A students. They might have, 25 seats for the students with disabilities, but they might not get that in that first category. So these are two different, it often is two different sets of criteria. The criteria itself is not published, you can't find out, but you can look at what the seats were and the demand for last year. And you really, when you start comparing schools in my schools, you can start getting a real sense as to how competitive the school was generally and what the atmosphere looks like for students with disabilities in terms of getting in. Also look at the priority groups, obviously. This is a school that was a 6 to 12 school, so they have priority for continuing 8th graders. Then they're looking for Manhattan students. And I don't think actually that's true anymore for schools. And then to New York City residents. So this was not, but other schools you might see other kinds of preferences listed. So screening methods, and I think this is why this presentation is an hour long, because New York City screening methods are complex and tough for parents to navigate. So I think I mentioned this earlier, but the middle school screen schools are ranking students based on their 4th grade scores, and high schools are looking at their 7th grade scores. And there's different ranking groups based on how they were doing in their core classes. There was a question in the chat of what if my child's coming from a private school, or what if my child is, my school doesn't do grades, they do progress. There are ways in which the DOE will convert whatever standard your child's school uses into one of those groups. And you should be able to see it on my schools when you're applying as to, this is where your child will fit. I know that my schools isn't open yet for middle school, for example, so you might not see it on there yet. So for audition schools or talent schools in general, and this is something where definitely make sure they may have different deadlines, they may have different ways to apply. And actually this says virtual and some in person. I just realized I don't know if there's as many virtual this year or if they have that. But certainly, you want to look at those things carefully. And a lot of times it's something where they're looking at a portfolio, or you have to go and perform. So for example, LaGuardia, one of the more popular schools, they're going to do an audition. And screen schools, I know Karen talked about this a little bit, but students are matched based on their English proficiency on a specific language at home. And obviously, that's something that for those students is extremely helpful. Someone asked about priority if they're moving from a middle school to a high school, or from elementary to middle. If you're at a school that's a K to 8 or a 6 to 12, you should have a guaranteed match, as long as it's one school, right? So some schools might have the same name, but they might be separate administrations. But if it's one administration and one school, you have a guaranteed match. Also zoned and geographic, you have priority or guarantee based on where you live. In high school, there's no district preference. And for zone, it means that, you know, it doesn't mean you're absolutely guaranteed. This comes up especially with elementary schools more, but there are times when there's more students in a zone than the zone school has seats for, and then you might not get a seat. But you certainly have priority for it. There's very, very few zoned high schools. I think there's only a handful in Queens, but there are more middle schools. Okay, so specialized programs. This was something that came up in the chat already, but these are programs that are outside the application process. So up to now, we've been talking all about you, the parent, looking at what is a school, looking for where does my child fit in their criteria, and how is that match going to work. For these programs, they're outside. So somebody from DOE Central is looking and saying, well, your child's special needs, and by special, I don't mean disability, I just mean your child's unique needs mean that we have to place them in this way. So bilingual ICT or special class. Unfortunately, there's far, far fewer bilingual teachers than there are students who need a bilingual special ed class. So if your child needs bilingual special ed, there is a centralized office that will try to make that happen. And because there's such a shortage of seats, they're going to be looking at where to place your child, and it may not be, you know, in your zone school, for example. Also ASD, Nest, and Horizon. These are some of the most popular schools for students with autism, and with good reason. They've really, really grown, especially Nest, but to a larger extent, more and more Horizon they're run with the idea that they train the teachers ahead of time and support the teachers during it to work with students with autism. So there's something that if your child might qualify for them, they can be a great fit. To look at that, you have to apply through the DOE Central. If you just Google it, you'll find the link to apply. And then when you get to the list of programs, you can list that program if it's on your student's IEP, and certainly speak with the central offices if you have questions or you're trying to figure out how to make that work. If you're not into that yet, but you would like to be, certainly apply, and then also do the application process. And you may want to consider listing a school, even if you don't have that on your IEP. So you're not able to list, for example, the Nest program yet, to apply to that school's gen ed program with the hopes that maybe you could get into the Nest program. ACEs is a similar type idea for students with intellectual disabilities. So it's a small class in a community school where all the students in that class have intellectual disabilities, and a teacher that should be trained to work with them. And then finally, somebody did ask about barrier-free schools. What I would say with trying to understand barrier-free or accessible schools is to go on the DOE's website. You can see in My Schools whether or not a school is fully accessible or partially accessible or not accessible. What I would advise you is, even with a school that says fully accessible, go and look at something called the BAP score, or the Building Accessibility Profile. And that's something that if you click on some links or if you Google it on the DOE's website, you can come up with that. And that breaks down in really specific terms. So this was important for me because my son used a wheelchair, and some schools that we saw that were fully accessible had maybe one bathroom on a floor other than where he was in a building with one elevator. And I was like, that's absolutely not going to work. Or his school that was also listed as fully accessible, where he did go to high school, the elevator was non-ADA compliant. It broke all the time. I'm not saying we wouldn't have gone there, but it was a drag, to be honest. And so it was, you know, what ended up working for us. And they were actually able to make a lot of changes while he was there. But certainly that's something to look at. If you find a school that is not barrier-free, but you think it is otherwise really appropriate, you can write into the DOE. There's an email on their website to write to accessibility and ask that they make accommodations for your child. And we actually have seen that happen, especially if it's something that, like, it's going to be hard to add a brand new elevator to an 8-story building that's old and there's no way to do it. But if it's something for like making a ramp or making a bathroom more accessible or figuring out a way that your child can get on stage, you should ask, because if that school is otherwise the right fit for you, you may be able to make that work. Okay, I'm sorry, I forgot I did have a slide on accessible schools. You can look up the BAP score, and this is actually a link to it. That's my son on our high school tour where he got locked in a school that was fully accessible, but the entrance that was accessible didn't have an intercom on it, so it was locked, and we actually got locked in, which he thought was hysterical, and I did not, but we didn't go to that school. Diversity admissions. This is something to keep in mind if your child has, if your family is low income and qualifies for free or reduced price lunch. And that's just the standards generally. Students learning English, students in temporary housing, and there are a few other ones as well. You may have a leg up in terms of getting into a school, so you can look at some of the schools that have diversity in enrollment and see if this is something that, as you're going through your complex calculation of, okay, I really like this school, but it's super competitive. What are my chances of getting in? If you have a child that has, reduced price lunch, maybe you have a better shot because they have a diversity initiative for that. So I know it is so much research, but it's something to look at, another factor. Okay, Karen, are there any questions we should be answering live now?
I've been getting a lot of questions regarding hold on. How is the IEP process different from the non-IEP standard process? How do we know if this for sure if the school is barrier free? So I feel like you've answered a couple of these. Could you transfer IEP with busing?
Yeah, so we'll get into this in a transfer an IEP with busing. That's a really good question, because I guess it depends on why your child has busing. If it's for distance and you go to a school that's closer, probably not. But I'm assuming that for an IEP, most specialized busing is more about their disability, and it should transfer. One thing I'm going to get into now, and we saw this in a lot of the pre-registration questions, is it's a really good question, is how do I know if a school has what's on my child's IEP? And I love the person who put in the chat early on, like, how do I ask this gently? I mean, sometimes you can't be gentle in this process. I mean, you don't want to be rude, but to be honest, it's ridiculous that you can't just look up and see what a school has. And schools, I think, are sometimes pretty cagey because legally they're supposed to serve all students with IEPs. Practically speaking, many of them don't have all the different types of programs or services at their school. Some schools are willing to be much more upfront about that, and others aren't. And just like I was describing with barrier free, where if a school just needs a ramp, you can ask for them to do that. Legally, they're supposed to accommodate you. The same is obviously true for an IEP. If your child has a small class on their IEP and that school does not have one, you can ask that they create one. Now, I think that's really talk about trying to measure things out and figure out, what you feel comfortable with. There's a range of parents. I have a range myself, how combative I feel every year, right? You might be in for more of a fight. And I think that's something to approach the conversation and to figure out what's the school's response. If I say my child needs a small class, some schools might say, oh, well, we have ICT and we can do sets and we've had great luck with people. And maybe you think that might work for your child, then okay. But if you think, no, my child really needs this, and you're asking, well, I really think I need a small class, and they might say, go somewhere else, we don't have it. They're not allowed to say that. And you can push, and those are cases that I escalate every day to DOE Central, not every day, but far too frequently, saying, they don't have a small class on their IEP. They have a small class on their IEP, the school is not providing it. And sometimes what happens is you get transferred to a different school. So I think ahead of time, as you're applying, it really makes sense to think about and to know about what do these schools provide. Some things, if they don't have a PT, a physical therapist, or an occupational therapist, you might be able to work that out. Although certainly you want to ask, do they have a therapy room, or where would they provide therapy? Things like that. Okay, so I'm going to get into hopefully answering some of those questions in this next section. First, I'm going to dive just a little bit more into the set-asides for students with IEPs. So a student is qualifies for the set aside for students with disability seats at a screen school if more than 20% of their classes, so that's not lunch, are special ed, meaning SETs, special education teacher support services, ICT, or small class. Sometimes people just think, oh, well, I have an IEP and my child gets 5 periods of SETs, which is the norm, and 5 periods of speech OT-PT. That is not going to qualify for it. The speech OT-PT doesn't count for the 20%. It has to be 20% of the classes, and SETs counts as a class, as a, it's a special education teacher. So for example, if you have a school that has 35 classes a week, less than 20% might be speech 5 times SETs. More than 20% would be ICT for all classes, a small class for all classes, or SETs times 10. Sometimes you see that. Sometimes you see SETs times 10 when a school does not have an ICT, for example. So that was their way to work around it. And keep in mind, it's unfortunate for everybody who is in 5th grade or in 8th grade at this training, and it's too late, but this is about what was last year's IEP if you're in that boat. So the 4th grade and 7th grade IEP. Okay. So the special education admissions, these students apply the same way, students with IEPs apply the same way as other students. The new school must implement the IEP. And any changes to the IEP should be based on the student's needs, not the school's program. So if you go to a school that does not have an ICT or has an ICT in English, but not in math, they should not just say, well, we need to open up your school at your IEP. At this school, we don't have math and we'll give you math sets. That's not what's supposed to happen. But the reality can be complicated, right? It can take a long time to find another school. Do you want to find another school? Can you force that school to open an ICT class in math? I would say if that's what your child needs, really make sure you're pushing early. Don't let a school tell you, well, we don't do that here. If you want something else, you parent have to go find it. It is the DOE's obligation to place your child in a program that can implement your child's IEP. That being said, it's a big system. So you have a right to the programs and services on your child's IEP. You do not have a right to a particular school. So that's why sometimes parents find themselves in this situation where maybe they agree to 7 periods of sets with a math teacher if they think that could work instead of an ICT math, for example. But far too frequently, we hear people tell us that the school just said, they don't do that here and I had no choice. You always have a choice. The one thing I would remind you all is the I in IEP stands for individualized. So any school saying, we don't do ICT here, that's not right. It may be that if you push really hard, you're going to end up at a different school, but it doesn't mean that your child doesn't have a right to what's on their IEP. And I would be really careful at an IEP meeting where they're seeking to make changes if you disagree. So, at this stage in the process, when you're trying to understand, does the school have a small class or an ICT? This gets really complicated and the screenshots may change a little bit over time. So this is what it looked like the last time I looked on it, but look up a school on the DOE website, go to school quality reports, click on the school quality guide, not the snapshot, and click on the plus next to students with disabilities. This may move around a little bit, but somewhere on that, you should be able to find how many students are at that school who have IEPs and where are they. So you can tell at this school, for example, there's 97 students, 20% are students with disabilities. And most of them are in ICT. There's 6 kids in gen ed with support, and there's less than 5 kids in self-contained settings. When I add that up, I'm not great at math, but 68 plus 6 is not 97. So I have a feeling that there's some students either that just have related services, or unfortunately that there's less than 5 students, but maybe there's 4 that have a self-contained recommendation and are not in it. But this, just to get a rough sense, if your child has an ICT, there's 68 students at this school that have ICTs. Or should be getting them. So that's a school that that might work for you. My favorite report, because I'm sorry, just going back to this one, it's often outdated. I don't think the information, in fact, I'm quite sure the information on there now is not this year. Hopefully it's last year, but it's a little bit unclear when it's from. The class size report is something that does get updated a lot more frequently. It is a ginormous Excel sheet, so don't try opening. I have tried opening it on my phone, but it's tough. And but if you have a computer or an iPad or something and open it up as this huge Excel sheet, you can sort by school and by district and see how many small classes do they have? How many ICTs do they have? This, for example, is a school that must be a very big school and it has a whole lot of them. You'll see grade levels. So this is just a really small screenshot so you can see some things, but you'll see how many sections, what the average number of students is per class. And it can be really, really helpful to see what's actually going on in a school. It does not tell you if it's a 12-to-1 or a 12-to-1-to-1. It doesn't tell you that much about, anything else, but it is a good way to try to get some information. So I did see somebody had their hand up. We are going to spend some time at the end answering questions, but I'll go through the rest of the presentation quickly first. I know we said this a lot, but every year we get calls from people in the fall that are somewhat heartbreaking, where they applied to a program because their guidance counselor told them to do it, or they thought they had to list 12 schools, but they didn't know what that school was. And then they got placed there. And that makes it so much harder to find another school. So try to only apply to schools you'd be happy to attend. Certainly rank in your true preference. You sometimes hear at the super competitive schools, they're saying, we only take people who rank us first. There's actually no way for them to know that. I don't think that it's completely untrue. It could be true if you have a school that gets hundreds of applications and they have 100 seats. The likelihood that only people who rank them first get in is much greater. But schools have no way to know your child's name. They can't see anything other than your child is in the students with disabilities category and by a number, or your child is in the gen ed category. So they can't see this. That's not true if you're talking about a school that's outside the application process. So like an ASD Nest or Horizon program, or you need a barrier-free program. Then there's a process that you can ask for that they are going to know your name. But usually that's what you want, because it's a program that you want them to be considering your child and making sure that if they think they're appropriate, they'll give them a spot. Make your last pick a safe school if you can, meaning you do want to have a range of schools and try to find things. I found a lot of information when I went on tours. I found schools that everybody says, oh, this is a great school, that I went into, and was like, this would be horrible. It's huge. It's a pressure cooker. My son would hate this school, even if it was actually, one of them was the most beautiful barrier-free school ever, but everything else about it was a barrier for him. So I thought, okay, this is not a good fit. Conversely, there were some schools that if you read Inside Schools or look at their graduation rates, it really didn't look so good, but the principal and the teachers were lovely. The atmosphere in the school was really warm. And for me, I was like, that's what's going to work for my child. He's somebody that really needs a community, a place that's going to be nurturing. And this is every year we get, and I think we already have a bunch of questions in the chat on, what's a good school for students with IEPs? We can't answer that. One, because disabilities cover a huge range. And two, because it's not like a child with a disability is the same as another child with a disability. It's so individualized, and what works for one child is not going to work for another. So unfortunately, it does mean doing a lot of research. Of course, if your child has a more specialized disability, like for me, I talked to every parent who had a kid who had a neuromuscular disability and a learning disability, and tried to figure out, where do these kids go? How does it work at the school? And if you're a parent of a child with autism, I'm sure you're in touch with other parents of kids with autism and trying to understand what the schools look like. Finally, one piece of advice is look into schools with multiple programs, because if it's a school that you really think is going to work for your child, obviously not if it doesn't work, but if it does, and you don't care, your child doesn't care if they're in the, social justice versus the economics program or whatever different programs there are, then you can list, multiple programs, or high school for art and design. If your child doesn't really know what they want to do and design is just as fine as photography, then list all those programs, and that gives you a way to list a school more than once. Language and interpretation. These are the top languages that you have a right to get translation and interpretation in. It's really, really important. Every year we talk to parents where this did not happen. It is a complicated enough process to navigate if you speak English. And if you're trying to navigate this system while speaking another language, it can be incredibly hard. So you do have a right to translation for all the different forms and documents. And you have a right to interpretation by somebody who's an interpreter. It can't be bring your older child in. We see that way too often. Or the school psychologist is going to interpret, but while they're also talking, and they'll say 2 paragraphs in English and then 3 words in Spanish, that's not an interpretation. So a parent has a right to an interpreter. A lot of times schools don't know how to get these resources, but DOE centrally does have them. So you can call this number or email this email and ask for help if your school doesn't know how to get interpretation and translation support. Finally, the IEP section on compensatory services is still there. We found far too infrequently were students getting this, even when COVID really did set them back. This is a section on the IEP that, from what we've heard, often gets skipped over. If your child really had a hard time during remote school, even though I know it's, a couple years down the road from it now, you should ask for extra services. And you can ask for that here, and the school is supposed to write in whether they said yes or no and why. And finally, this is nothing to do with high school or middle school applications, but because this is a time of year when we see parents suddenly juggling suspension, particularly if your child's in 8th grade. 8th grade is the year when I don't know what it is. Kids have budding independence and still have a lot of room with their executive functioning to develop. And you see them get suspended at a much greater rate than in other years. No one plans to have their child suspended. So this is just a real quick slide to make sure you know that if your child is suspended, you're supposed to get notice in writing. They can't send your child home without any work. They're supposed to give your child another location to go to, or to have your child be in school with work. For a principal suspension, you want to ask for a conference with the principal. For a superintendent suspension, you want to ask for something called the packet. That's really important. They're supposed to give it to you, but they often don't. And finally, know that AFC does provide information and very limited circumstances, sometimes representation on suspensions. So reach out to us if you're in that situation. And finally, we will answer questions, but please take this survey. It's really, really important for our funders and for us. We actually read all the recommendations in here. We read what worked, what didn't. So please take it. When you close out of this, it should open up, but you can also do it through this QR code or on this link. And oh, you know what? And I have a few more polls to go through while we're answering questions. I'll go here this is our helpline and our email. If you would, for anybody that's listening to this or who signed in, we will send you a copy of this PowerPoint. It usually takes a couple days for us to get everything together, and it will also be posted on our YouTube site with the PowerPoint. So all this information is there. I'm going to go back here and I'm going to launch a poll. And then we can, these polls actually are also just really help us understand who's here. We want to report on ethnicity and race for our funders. So if people can answer this, that would be incredibly helpful. Thank you so much. And Karen, if you want to start answering questions, I'll launch the other poll in a minute. But if you want to unmute and ask any questions that came in, I haven't been looking at the chat. So.
All right, thank you, Kim. I've been getting a lot of questions regarding sibling priority. And so from what I know, middle school applicants have a priority to attend the same school as their sibling. I don't think that's applicable to high school. And then I mean, Kim, correct me if I'm wrong,
And
but
that's as far as I know too. I'd
yeah,
have to double check in the chancellor's regulations, but it's mostly an elementary school thing. But there
yeah,
is some preference for middle school, and I don't think it applies in high school either.
yeah, yeah. So I'm just gonna,
And this, I just launched the federal disability categories. What this means is, what is your child's classification on their IEP? This is also really helpful for us to know. So thank you so much to everybody who's taking it. And I promise I just have one more after this. Any other questions that are coming up that
yeah, I just saw, Michelle asked, can your office, get my son into a private school if no public school, if no public school is like, viable? And so, if you're interested in applying to a non-public school, you can email us or call us, and we are able to provide you with 3 ways. If again, if you live in New York City and you would like to apply to non-public schools, 3 different ways you can do that. So I'm going to just um, drop in the chat our helpline number and our info email, and we can definitely help you navigate that process.
And finally, I just launched the last feedback survey, which if you take our survey, you don't need to do this one, but it does help us get some information. If you do take our survey, you can always skip these questions or do them again. There's some open-ended ones that are really, really helpful for us too. In terms of, we can't get anybody into a private school. I think that's one thing where they're like, well, my child is perfect for the school. If the school says no, it's unlikely we'll be able to help. But I'm assuming what you mean is, can we help you figure out which private schools are right? Usually what we do is send parents a list. If you're looking at state approved schools, there is a list. It got a lot more complicated this year, but there is a list on the New York State Education website. If you Google approved private schools, New York State, you should find it. It's an Excel sheet that opens up. It used to be a really simple form, and unfortunately they made it way more complicated. And most parents are looking for something called 853. It's the number of I don't remember if it's the law or the regulation that authorizes these schools. And you can search by, do they take students with autism? Do they take students with emotional disabilities? Where are they located? What grades do they take? And that's a way that you can sort and filter that Excel sheet in different ways. And then there's also non-approved schools in New York. And that's we do have, sometimes we can help parents navigate that. Certainly, if you're speaking with people or other parents, you can get some information. For those schools, and often even for the approved schools, you may need an attorney or advocate to work with you. AFC has very limited ability to provide representation, and we can only provide representation to low-income families. But our helpline is open to anybody, and we can talk through things and, give you a list of advocates and attorneys, and sometimes help somebody, navigate the process a little bit. So it is complicated, but certainly we have had parents find an appropriate private school that way. Okay. Any other questions that we should be answering? I think there's a lot that said, will we be sharing it? We will.
Yep.
So somebody asking, my son is in 5th grade and is in Nest. I don't think so. I think you should just be listing the Nest program schools and also speaking with Central DOE to see what they're likely to place them in. You should be able to, when you go to my schools, you should be able to click on the Nest program schools. And I think it's a filter there as well, and list them in your preference. But also because it's done centrally as opposed to through some blind lottery where they don't know who's applying, like through the match. This is done through a centralized office, so you could probably reach out as well. Oh, somebody asked, could I put the link in the chat? And I'm not sure what link. Maybe the state ed one. I'll try to find that if that's the case. So many schools don't offer ICTs for APs. Yes, that's absolutely true. And schools that say they're trying to phase out ICT in 11th and 12th, I mean, I would just, that's nonsense. they're not allowed to say your child's been in school long enough, they don't have their disability anymore. That's not how that works. That's a resources question, and I would push back pretty hard on it. That being said, I would say the same way there's a huge shortage of bilingual special education teachers, there is a huge shortage of high school special education teachers who are also licensed in whatever field. It's why for a student who has a small class, it's very hard to find a high school that has a full array of small classes in all subjects and in all grades. And if you do find it, you're often looking at very big schools, which sometimes for a student who needs a small class is not a good fit. So that becomes a little bit complicated. But really all high schools should have ICTs in all subjects, in all grades. They don't. I'm not saying that they do. And I do think, of course, not providing it in AP is offensive because there's an assumption that if you have a disability, you wouldn't be taking an AP, and that's just not true. And I would push back. That being said, you could ask for extra sets, perhaps, maybe even, hopefully with somebody that could collaborate with them, but it would make sense to push back on that. Sorry, I'm just reading the chat.
Yeah, someone said, if you don't have a My Schools account when high school admissions are open, are you going to get a bad lottery number? The lottery numbers, again, are just randomly generated, so there is no bad lottery number.
Yeah, as far as I feel like I don't totally have the information to know that. I understand the idea, like, well, what if they already gave out 1,000 lottery numbers? But I think you're right, Karen. It is random. Yeah. Somebody said, how many boxes need to get checked to qualify? It's not boxes for students with disabilities. I'm sorry. It's that 20% or more of your program is in a special ed class or special ed program. So that means if you have ICT or self-contained, you qualify. It's if you don't have ICT or self-contained that you need to have typically over 7 periods of sets. So if you have a whole lot of related services, you won't qualify. It does not mean that you might not find a school that works for you. It just means that your disability was not significant enough to need that level of academic support. And the idea with the set aside, just to go back to why it was created, was they found too many schools, their screens were essentially segregating out students with disabilities. And they wanted to make sure that all schools took in all students. And so that's why they set that up. But because of that, they were finding the students with the most significant needs were not being placed. So students that had really, very narrow screens were taking the students who had 1 period of speech on an IEP and saying we serve students with IEPs, but they didn't really. They serve students with very, very, very minimal needs. And so that set aside was set up to push back against that. I do see a lot of students where it's a little bit gray. The reason they have 5 periods of sets and 5 periods of speech is because that school didn't have ICT. And that's unfortunate. It means that, unless you're listening to this in 4th grade and can advocate for a change to your IEP, or 7th grade, you may not get that set aside. Okay. All right. Well, I think unfortunately there's maybe more questions than we can answer. I don't know. We'll see. Let me see. Child is in a 6 to 12 school. No, you don't need to answer them. We did answer that one live. If this child has an IEP, do they have priority? I think we answered that. So lottery numbers for schools that use auditions or essays, I think that my understanding is just like a screen. If they have, enough students that they wanted to list in that category, like you all aced your dance audition, but they have 15 seats for dances and they had 20 people that fit that, then maybe lottery numbers come into play, but probably not anywhere near as much. My understanding is that's usually not the case, that usually the lottery number doesn't matter that much. It's way more based on your audition. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just looking through really quickly. A lot of these we actually did answer live. Okay, so somebody said my child has always been exempt from state testing. So I think that's a little complicated. Did you mean you opted your child out of state testing? Then they would just look at the grades. If you mean your child has alternate assessment, that's a different situation, and you want to think really carefully about that. Most students with alternate assessment are in a District 75 program. If they're not, and you're in a District 1 through 32, or a typical school, you should know that your child will not be on track to get a high school diploma. And we sometimes see students who had alternate assessment checked, meaning they're exempt from testing, but the parent did not realize that meant no opportunity to try for a high school diploma. If your child is in an inclusion program or District 75 inclusion program, or just a regular inclusion program, and you're okay with that, the main thing is the social inclusion and the exposure to grade level. That's fine. But it's always something where we want to make sure a parent understands what it means if they see that box checked, alternate assessment. Yeah, and somebody said, I think I made this point, but it is so complicated that if my child has an ICT, are they qualified in 100% of their classes? Do they qualify as a student with a disability? Yes, they do. And do all schools have seats for students with disabilities? Yes, but at some schools it doesn't matter. It's the same. You're just as likely to get in as a gen ed student, as a student with disability. It's really for the more super competitive schools that can really come into play. Oh, that's a good question. Somebody said, what would be considered a high demand school? The DOE always has this. I think it actually is more like 10 or 15 students per seat. I can't remember. It's a great question. Actually, I know it's in their guide. And I think that when you're looking at schools, you're going to get a sense of the range. There was some year when I heard that it was easier to get into Harvard than it was to get into Eleanor Roosevelt or something. I don't know if that was true, but this process, we are in New York, we are in a hyper competitive sort of neurotic environment, and then this process is so hard, and it's your children, so it is really fraught. I just want to put that out there, and I know that it's really hard. Try to keep an even keel about it. No wait lists do move, so if you really panic about your match in April, definitely make sure that you're on every wait list that you would want to be, and keep an eye on it. Okay. I don't know how it works with GNT if you're designated to go. I don't think so. I think you just want to list a school that had a gifted and talented program. It's not a placement in the same way. Somebody was asking, are there designated spots for GNT? Yeah, so you have to have ASD Nest, or somebody asked, do you have to have ASD Nest or Horizon listed on your child's IEP? My understanding is that's correct. If it's not listed, make sure you apply right away to ASD Nest or Horizon. You can do that on the DOE website. There's a link to click, and an email where you can write in, and make sure you're applying to that. And then you may want to really prioritize schools that have those programs. Because, for example, my son was at a school that does not have autism. He has actually a whole lot of different disabilities, but not that one. But he was at a school that had a NEST program, and he benefited a lot from the teacher's expertise in the NEST program, because even though he didn't have autism, a lot of his processing issues and reading comprehension issues were things that the NEST teachers were actually pretty good at helping him with. And it's not like that NEST teacher can only teach students with autism. They can also teach other students. They taught the NEST ICT, and then they taught just the regular ICT. And so it could be really helpful. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, and unfortunately, somebody who asked, my child did not have an IEP in 4th grade, but qualifies as a student with disability in 5th. My understanding is they will not be considered as a student with disability for the middle school application process. Certainly, you can write to middle school enrollment, it's MS enrollment at schools.nyc.gov. Make sure you're writing in and asking, but my understanding is no, unfortunately. Okay, I'm just going to try to keep going through these questions.
Yeah, I'm gonna drop in the chat the link to the class size reports. I've seen a couple
Oh,
of
thank you.
yeah. I'm just gonna.
Somebody said ICT doesn't have staff retention. I mean, that's a really big issue, and it really worries me with these budget cuts too and a hiring freeze. I don't see how they can have a freeze on hiring if a special education teacher leaves. They have a legal responsibility to provide that. So I don't know exactly how that's going to work. Specialized high schools and ICT classes. That's a really good question. Meaning if you're taking the Shazat. I actually don't know the answer. The last time I checked, none of them had them. It does not mean they don't have special education. You can get special education services and supports. They may have them now. I mean, it's surprising that they couldn't get away with that. But it is really, really important. I would certainly ask. I would not just ask one person at a school. I would ask multiple people how they support students with disabilities. And to be honest, we do sometimes hear from parents after their child got into, one of the specialized schools, it not working out because they really weren't accommodating their child's needs. And that just goes to how much of a fight are you willing to have. Legally, they should be required to, provide what's on your child's IEP. Practically speaking, I think they often get away with not doing it. And I'm just speaking as like from what I have heard from years of helping support families that come in through our helpline or email on our website. So I think that it is a really tough one. On the other hand, if your child gets into one of those schools and otherwise thinks it would be a great fit, maybe there's a way to wrap around support in other ways or to push to get stuff that will help. So that's a really individualized determination. It is frustrating that they don't do a better job of providing support for students with disabilities. And somebody saying, does a student need to have NEST on their IEP or just an autism classification? I assume you mean to apply to an ASD program. They need to have that ASD NEST or Horizon program on their IEP. However, you can get that on your IEP now if you're writing in, so you might have time to do it. And to make sure at least they know that this is something your child would like. And we do see people that don't have that in their IEP that get into it. I worked with a number of families that got into one this September. Obviously, that was nerve-wracking for the families. They were in a school that they didn't feel like could meet their needs. When we were trying to unpack why they couldn't meet their needs, it became apparent that they would be appropriate for a NEST or Horizon program. And by working with DOE Central, we were able to get them moved into one. But as a parent, you'd rather do that in the spring or in the fall for next year than have going through that in September. So hopefully that helps. I don't think you have a better chance of getting into NEST programs if you live closer to them. I think the NEST programs, it's an expanded program, but it's still pretty small. So I think it really has to do with, are you placed there centrally? I mean, you would think that DOE Central would want to place somebody closer. They save costs on busing or whatever, but I don't know that it always happens that way. And so somebody asked, and this is a really good question, what if I only apply to 8 schools and I don't get accepted at one of them? That happens. You will get matched with a school. It may just be completely a different school. As Karin started this, you will get waitlisted at every school that you applied to. And you should look at your number on that and know that it can move, and they move even up until the next school year begins. So I have talked to parents every year who get off a wait list. And 12 schools is a lot. I'm a very knowledgeable parent who did a lot of research, and I was unable to list 12 schools. Granted, I needed a school that was barrier free. There weren't really 12 barrier free high schools that I could apply to that would work for my son in the borough we live in. So that narrowed it, but I understand having a hard time listing 12 schools. I think the only thing I would say is make sure you try to list a range of schools. Okay, this one we answered live. Just bear with me. I'm just going through them real quick. Somebody got extra IEP summer sessions in 2021 by writing the district. That's fantastic. You can, keep in mind that, and this is not anything to do with applying to high school or middle school, but I have seen parents come up with really creative solutions or get more help. And just keep in mind the DOE as a whole is much bigger than an individual school. So if your child needs something and you're not able to advocate for it effectively at the school, going up to the superintendent, talking to other schools, trying to be creative. Sometimes you can come up with something. And we do have trainings on special ed or navigating issues on our YouTube site. So I would definitely look at that as well. Okay, you get manually assigned to a high school and you don't get a spot on the wait list. How soon can you initiate a transfer? I mean, you may not be able to. You can ask for a transfer, and there's a whole guide on or a fact sheet on our website about different ways to get a transfer, but sometimes it's not possible to transfer out. I know that's really anxiety producing. I would say, I think the DOE says 95% of parents get a school on their, if they list 12 schools, and 75% get a school in their top 3. I think, of course, that's not really very comforting if you're the 5% or you're the 25%. So it can be tough. And I have seen parents, have to do all kinds of different things and try to work with guidance counselor transfers or look at charter schools or, all different solutions. The only thing I would say is you all are just applying now. It is so easy to drop down into a rabbit hole of despair and worry. But most people I know do end up okay. And don't forget, you want to survive the stress of this period, because that alone can make both you and your child bananas. So just trying to take a deep breath and know that most people do make it through. And I think just doing as much research as you can and going on as many school tours as you can. It is really hard to do that. But I would say, I know I mentioned it in the beginning, but there were some schools that I saw that I was really, impressed by the atmosphere in the school and how they interacted with the students. And I would not have gotten that if I just read reviews somewhere. Okay. All right, we're getting through them. Just looking and see if I missed any. Karen, how do you know if the high school has adaptive phys ed? That's something that should get set up after your child is there. So it's not something that, it's done centrally. It's not through the high school. Certainly you can ask about it and see if that's ever something that they've had done. And sometimes, for my child, for example, he loved adaptive PE in elementary and middle, but in high school, he way preferred having his OT push into gen ed gym. It was better for him socially. So sometimes there's different ways you can make things work. Okay. Somebody said, should my child not apply to any school with over 3 apps per seat? Terrible. No, look, listed. I think you want to have a range, but definitely apply. You can't look if they're all super screened schools, then maybe not. But I think that you should always list some schools that you really want to get into. And if you have a terrible lottery number, I'm so sorry. I know that's really, really stressful. But I do know people with terrible lottery numbers who ended up with good matches. And, I know somebody with a terrible lottery number who ended up with their child in parochial school. So I'm not saying it's not very stressful. But I think you should put a range, and I certainly wouldn't give somebody advice to don't list anything over that has more than 3 seats. Okay. Oh, if you have, somebody said they applied 7 months ago for the ASD application process, but haven't heard, follow up, write a whole bunch of emails, try to also include special education at schools.nyc.gov. That's not right. You should have already heard. And it sounds like your application got lost or stuck somewhere. Okay, so, and there are some very specific questions about, what schools to apply to, for a parent that their child is complaining about being pulled out of ELA and math and struggling. Being pulled out is hard, especially if they're pulled out at times that don't make sense, or if they don't have a great connection with the teacher. But I don't think that means that I would say you should definitely apply to X school. It might be that your child would do better with an ICT, for example, than being pulled out. But it's hard to answer something that specifically. Okay, I think we may have answered everything. If there's anyone still on and you're like, you didn't answer me, I apologize. I think we got through it all. So definitely, if I can stop, I should try to figure out how to stop recording.
Here I can-
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.